To step into the Middle Ages is to enter a world where faith was not merely personal belief but the very fabric of society. Medieval Europe was called Christendom, a civilization defined by Christianity, in which every aspect of life, from birth to death, was shaped by the Church. Kings ruled by divine sanction, peasants worked under the gaze of saints, and even the humblest laborer believed their toil was part of God's great design. The word Christendom is not just a geographic term but a cultural one. It described the idea of a united Christian community stretching from the Atlantic to the Holy Land. Pilgrims, priests, and crusaders all moved through this spiritual landscape, bound together by rituals, festivals, and sacred stories. It was not a world without conflict. Indeed, kings and popes clashed often, but the Church remained the central pillar, giving meaning, order, and rhythm to daily life. The Church's guide and authority. In medieval Europe, the Church was everywhere. Cathedrals dominated skylines, monasteries dotted the countryside, chapels stood in villages where bells marked the hours of prayer. Priests baptized infants, married couples, and buried the dead. The Church recorded births and deaths, owned vast lands, and advised rulers. Its authority extended to law, morality, and even science. This was a world where salvation and eternal life were more important than worldly success. To sin was not only to break a moral code but to endanger one's soul. The Church taught that heaven and hell awaited after death, and this belief gave its rituals immense weight. To be excommunicated, cut off from the sacraments, was a punishment worse than imprisonment, for it threatened eternal damnation. Daily life shaped by faith. For the average medieval person, religion was woven into every detail of existence. The calendar itself was structured around the liturgical year: Advent, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, and countless saints' feast days. Fields were blessed before planting, marriages were sanctified, and even contracts were sworn upon relics. Pilgrimages became powerful acts of devotion. Ordinary men and women traveled long distances to visit shrines like Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury, believing such journeys could heal illness, cleanse sins, or bring divine favor. These pilgrim routes also connected cultures, spreading ideas, art, and commerce across Europe. Monasteries and learning. Beyond parish churches, monasteries played a vital role in shaping Christendom. Monks and nuns lived under strict rules, devoting themselves to prayer, study, and labor. They copied manuscripts by hand, preserving classical texts alongside biblical commentary. Without these communities, much of ancient knowledge might have been lost. Monasteries were also centers of innovation, brewing beer, advancing agricultural techniques, and offering hospitality to travelers. They stood as both spiritual and practical hubs, embodying the medieval ideal of ora et labora, pray and work. Faith and power. Religion was not only spiritual but political. Kings ruled with papal blessing, and rulers often clashed with the Church over authority. The investiture controversy of the 11th century, when popes and emperors disputed who could appoint bishops, reveals how spiritual and secular power were tightly intertwined. Yet faith also unified. Despite wars and rivalries, Christendom held a shared vision of order. The Crusades, though violent and controversial, were launched under the idea of protecting the faith and reclaiming holy lands. To join a crusade was to believe one could gain both honor on earth and salvation in heaven. Faith in art and symbolism. Art, architecture, and music all reflected the centrality of Christianity. Stained glass windows told biblical stories for the illiterate. Illuminated manuscripts glowed with gold leaf. Chants filled monasteries with sacred sound. Even castles often contained chapels, reminding nobles that spiritual life underpinned political rule. Every symbol carried meaning. The cross was both protection and identity. The circle of a cathedral's rose window represented eternity. Light filtering through colored glass was understood as divine presence itself. For medieval people, beauty was not decoration, it was a revelation of God's truth. Modern reflections. For us today, Christendom may seem distant. Yet its legacy remains in law, universities, literature, and even our calendar. The medieval fusion of faith and society shows us how belief can shape culture, politics, and identity. It also invites reflection. In a world often fragmented and secular, what does it mean to live within a shared vision of values and meaning? The people of Christendom did not separate the sacred from the ordinary, they saw both as threads in the same tapestry. To enter their world is to rediscover a society where life was lived with constant reference to eternity. Thus begins our journey through medieval life. Faith was the air people breathed, the ground they walked upon, the light through which they saw themselves and their world. To understand the Middle Ages, we must first understand Christendom, the world of faith that defined an entire civilization. If the cathedral embodied the grandeur of medieval faith, the village represented its heartbeat. The majority of people in the Middle Ages lived not in castles or cities but in small rural communities, where survival depended on the cycles of nature, cooperation, and the guidance of tradition. The medieval village was more than a cluster of houses. It was a social organism where labor, worship, and community life were inseparable. To walk through such a village is to glimpse the daily rhythm of an age defined by both hardship and solidarity. The physical layout of the village. A typical village was small, often no more than a few dozen families, yet it was structured with order and meaning. At its center stood the parish church, the spiritual heart where baptisms, marriages, and funerals took place. Nearby lay the village green or common pasture, used for grazing animals or hosting seasonal festivals. Surrounding it were simple houses, wattle and daub huts with thatched roofs, often shared with livestock in winter for warmth. Beyond the homes stretched the fields, organized in the open field system. Long strips of land divided among families, rotated for crops and left fallow in turn. Boundaries were marked not by fences but by memory and community trust. The fields were the village's lifeline, tying every family to collective labor and mutual dependence. Work in the rhythm of seasons. Peasant life followed the rhythm of the agricultural year. Spring brought plowing and sowing, summer demanded endless weeding and haymaking, autumn required harvesting, and winter, though quieter, meant mending tools and caring for livestock. Work was exhausting, but it carried the dignity of necessity. Without it, survival was impossible. Men, women, and children all contributed. Men plowed with oxen, women spun wool, baked bread, and tended gardens, while children herded geese or collected firewood. Labor was communal, often performed in teams, reflecting the interdependence of village life. To shirk duty was not only dishonorable but dangerous, for the village could not afford weakness in its ranks. Food in daily life. The medieval diet was simple but sustaining. Bread was its foundation, made from rye, barley, or, for the fortunate, wheat. Pottage, a thick stew of grains, vegetables, and occasional scraps of meat, was a daily staple. Dairy, eggs, and seasonal fruits supplemented the diet, while ale was consumed more regularly than water, as it was safer and nourishing. Hunger was a constant threat, especially in years of bad harvest. Famine was never far away, yet feasts and festivals punctuated the cycle of scarcity, offering moments of joy, abundance, and community bonding. Community and responsibility. The village was not merely a collection of individuals but a tightly bound community governed by custom and necessity. Disputes over land or livestock were settled by elders or in manorial courts, where justice was less about abstract law and more about restoring harmony. Neighbors relied on one another for survival. During harvest, families shared labor. During illness, others stepped in to tend fields or animals. This sense of mutual responsibility was both practical and moral, reinforced by the teachings of the parish priest and the expectations of tradition. Faith in everyday village life. Religion permeated the village just as it did Christendom at large. Bells called peasants to Mass, fields were blessed at Rogationtide, saints' days offered rest from labor. The church calendar provided structure, balancing toil with ritual and celebration. Superstition and folk practices blended with official religion. Charms, blessings, and seasonal rituals reflected a worldview where the natural and supernatural were intertwined. For villagers, faith was not abstract theology but a lived reality, woven into sowing, harvesting, childbirth, and death. Festivals and social bonds. Despite hardship, medieval villages knew joy. Festivals were times of respite, when work paused and the community gathered to dance, feast, and play games. May Day celebrations, harvest feasts, and Christmas revelry strengthened bonds and offered symbolic victories over the hardships of daily life. Music, storytelling, and folk plays preserved tradition and identity, passing down legends and wisdom from one generation to the next. These moments of laughter and shared culture gave peasants resilience, reminding them that life was more than toil, it was also community and joy. Reflections for modern audiences. The medieval village reveals a society rooted in interdependence. Though life was hard, it was also deeply communal. Modern individualism contrasts sharply with this worldview, where one family's survival depended on the strength and cooperation of all. Studying the village reminds us that resilience often comes from solidarity, and that the rhythms of nature, though harsh, can also foster humility and endurance. The people of the village knew that life was fragile, yet they lived it fully, marked by labor, faith, and tradition. Closing of Chapter 2. The medieval village was the stage where most of life unfolded. A world of simple homes, communal fields, unending toil, and sacred rituals. It was a place of both vulnerability and strength, where hardship was tempered by solidarity, and faith gave meaning to survival. To understand the Middle Ages, we must listen to the voices of the village, for it was here, more than anywhere else, that Christendom lived and breathed in its most human form. If the medieval village was the foundation of daily survival, feudalism was the system that bound those villages into a broader political and social order. To modern eyes, the feudal system may seem rigid and even unjust, but to medieval people it provided structure, protection, and identity. At its heart was a web of obligations and loyalties, linking kings, nobles, knights, clergy, and peasants into a hierarchy that mirrored the cosmic order they believed God had ordained. The logic of feudalism. Feudalism arose from necessity. After the collapse of centralized Roman authority, Europe fractured into smaller territories, vulnerable to raids and invasions. Kings and rulers could not protect vast lands alone, so they relied on local lords who, in turn, depended on vassals and knights. This system of land in exchange for service created a framework that endured for centuries. At its simplest, feudalism was a contract. A lord granted land or fief to a vassal who swore loyalty and provided military service. Below them, serfs worked the land, tied to estates that provided the wealth sustaining the entire order. Each level depended on the other, binding society in a network of obligation that extended from the highest monarch to the humblest peasant. Lords and vassals. At the top of the feudal hierarchy stood the king, who granted lands to powerful nobles. These lords then distributed portions to vassals, lesser nobles or knights, in return for service. Loyalty was cemented through ceremonies of homage, where a vassal knelt before his lord, placed his hands between the lord's and swore an oath of fidelity. This relationship was not purely symbolic. It was legally binding and sacred, often sealed on relics or holy texts. To break one's oath was to commit both treason and sin. Trust and loyalty were the currency of power, and betrayal could unravel entire regions. The knights and their role. Knights were the warriors of the feudal order, bound by chivalric ideals but also by practical obligations. A knight owed military service to his lord. 40 days a year was the common expectation, though this varied. In return, he received land or payment, enabling him to maintain his equipment, horses, and household. Knighthood carried prestige but also responsibility. Knights defended their lord's lands, enforced justice, and sometimes served as administrators. Over time, the ideals of chivalry infused their role, emphasizing honor, loyalty, and protection of the weak, though in practice, knights could be as brutal as mercenaries. The serfs, bound to the land. At the bottom of the system were the serfs, who worked the fields and provided the economic foundation of feudal society. Unlike slaves, serfs could not be bought or sold individually, but they were bound to the land and its lord. They owed labor, rents, and a share of their harvest, leaving them little surplus. Life for serfs was difficult, marked by hard labor and limited freedom. Yet serfdom also provided stability. Lords were expected to protect their peasants from raids and famine. For many, security, however limited, outweighed the risks of being unprotected in a violent and unstable world. The role of the church in feudalism. The church both sanctified and benefited from feudalism. Bishops and abbots often acted as lords, controlling vast estates worked by peasants. Monasteries collected tithes, administered justice, and contributed to local economies. Spiritually, the church reinforced the hierarchy, teaching that just as serfs owed obedience to lords, so all people owed obedience to God. The feudal pyramid reflected the medieval cosmos. Everyone had their place and harmony depended on each fulfilling their duty. Feudal justice and obligation. Feudal relationships were maintained through justice and custom. Lords presided over manorial courts, resolving disputes about land, inheritance, or labor. Justice was local, often informal, and shaped by tradition rather than written law. These courts reinforced the reciprocal nature of feudalism. A serf might be fined or punished, but he also had the right to seek protection. A vassal owed loyalty, but he could also demand that his lord provide land and defend him. Feudalism, though hierarchical, was not one-sided. It was a system of interlocking obligations. Strengths and weaknesses of feudalism. Feudalism provided stability in an age of danger, but it also had weaknesses. Loyalties were personal, not institutional, making the system fragile. If a lord betrayed his king, or if knights deserted their lord, entire networks could collapse. Civil wars, rival claims, and shifting alliances frequently tested the limits of the system. Nevertheless, feudalism endured because it adapted. Over centuries, it became less about military service and more about economic rents and political negotiation. Yet the language of loyalty and obligation remained central to medieval identity. Reflections for modern audiences. Feudalism seems alien to us, but echoes remain. The idea of reciprocal obligation, duty given in return for protection, still resonates in modern discussions of governance and social contracts. Loyalty, service, and trust remain essential to human communities, even if the structures have changed. For medieval people, feudalism was not oppression but order. It gave meaning and security in uncertain times, binding society together in ways both practical and spiritual. Its lessons remind us that systems of power, however flawed, are always attempts to organize human needs for protection, stability, and belonging. Closing of Chapter 3. The feudal system was not just a political arrangement, it was the scaffolding of medieval life. Lords, vassals, knights, and serfs were bound in a network of obligation that mirrored the cosmos itself. To understand the Middle Ages, we must understand this system, for it shaped not only the land but the very souls of those who lived upon it. The medieval landscape was dotted with symbols of authority, but none loomed larger, literally and figuratively, than the castle. Rising from hilltops or guarding river crossings, castles embodied both protection and domination. They were fortresses of stone and mortar, but also theaters of politics, ceremony, and daily life. To step inside a medieval castle is to enter the very heart of feudal power, where warriors plotted campaigns, nobles held court, and servants sustained a world defined by hierarchy and ambition. The evolution of the castle. Castles evolved from simple wooden fortifications in the early Middle Ages to the imposing stone keeps of the High Middle Ages. At first, motte and bailey designs, wooden towers on earthen mounds, offered quick defense against raids. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, stone construction transformed castles into near-impregnable strongholds. Walls thick enough to withstand catapults, towers offering views of miles of countryside, and moats filled with water or sharpened stakes all made castles formidable. Yet castles were never just military installations, they were also residences, administrative centers, and symbols of a lord's prestige. The keep and inner life. At the core of the castle stood the keep, the central stronghold that housed the lord's family and closest retainers. Inside, life combined luxury and austerity. The Great Hall was the castle's beating heart, a cavernous chamber where feasts, court sessions, and ceremonies unfolded beneath soaring rafters and banners of heraldry. Meals in the hall were more than sustenance, they were performances of power. The lord and lady sat at a raised table, presiding over knights, clergy, and guests. Musicians played, jesters entertained, and messengers brought news from across the realm. Each gathering reinforced the hierarchy of medieval life, reminding all who entered where authority resided. The courtly world. Beyond the fortress walls lay the intangible yet equally vital concept of court. A medieval court was a society in miniature, where loyalty, etiquette, and intrigue intertwined. Knights pledged service, poets recited verses, and noblewomen influenced politics through council or marriage alliances. Court life was governed by ritual. Audiences with the lord were carefully staged. Gestures, dress, and words all conveyed rank and respect. To succeed in court required more than martial skill, it demanded diplomacy, wit, and an understanding of the delicate choreography of power. Servants and daily labor. Though castles appear to us as majestic fortresses, they depended on an invisible workforce. Servants, cooks, grooms, laundresses, and soldiers sustained daily life. Their tasks ranged from maintaining fires in the drafty halls to tending horses in stables and carrying water up endless staircases. For these workers, the castle was both livelihood and prison. Their days were filled with toil, but service also brought proximity to power. A loyal servant might gain the patronage of a noble, and a skilled cook or scribe could rise above humble origins. The castle was a crucible of opportunity as well as hardship. Defense and siege warfare. Castles were designed for war as much as for ceremony. Battlements, arrow slits, murder holes, and drawbridges gave defenders every advantage. In times of conflict, peasants from nearby villages often sought refuge within the walls, crowding into courtyards for safety. Yet no castle was invulnerable. Siege engines such as trebuchets hurled stones capable of shattering walls, while miners tunneled beneath fortifications to collapse them. Starvation was perhaps the most effective weapon. Besieging armies could simply wait until supplies inside ran out. Every castle carried the paradox of safety and vulnerability, grandeur and isolation, symbolism and power. Castles were more than military assets. They were symbols of authority carved into the landscape. To see a castle on the horizon was to be reminded of the Lord's dominance and the reach of his justice. They projected permanence even when dynasties faltered. For lords and monarchs, castles were expressions of legitimacy. The construction of massive stone fortresses required wealth, labor, and vision. Each tower and curtain wall proclaimed, "I rule here and my power is unshakable." In this sense, castles were as much propaganda as defense. Reflections for modern audiences. Today we may marvel at castles as romantic ruins or tourist attractions, but in the Middle Ages they were living symbols of control. They embodied the duality of protection and oppression, sheltering allies while intimidating foes. Modern parallels can be found in the architecture of power even now: grand government buildings, corporate headquarters, or presidential palaces. Like castles, these structures are not only functional but symbolic, shaping how people perceive authority. Closing of Chapter 4. The medieval castle was a fortress, a residence, and a stage for the theater of power. Within its halls, lords dispensed justice, alliances were forged, and daily life unfolded in the shadow of stone walls. Castles and courts remind us that power is never only military, it is cultural, social, and symbolic. To understand them is to glimpse the ambitions and anxieties of a world where authority had to be built, defended, and displayed in every stone. If castles embodied power in stone, monasteries embodied devotion in silence. Across medieval Europe, cloisters rose in valleys, on hillsides, and along pilgrim routes, offering not only places of prayer but also centers of learning, charity, and preservation. To enter a monastery was to step into another rhythm of life, where time was measured not by the cycles of crops or battles, but by the tolling of bells that called monks to prayer, study, and labor. The monastic ideal. The roots of medieval monasticism stretched back to the deserts of Egypt, where early hermits sought solitude with God. By the Middle Ages, these ideals were organized into communities governed by rules, most famously the rule of Saint Benedict. Benedict envisioned a life of ora et labora, prayer and work, balance between contemplation and practical labor. Monks renounced personal wealth, family ties, and worldly ambition. Their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were seen as radical acts of devotion, creating islands of holiness amid a turbulent world. To medieval society, monasteries were places where heaven touched earth. The daily rhythm. Monastic life followed a precise schedule, guided by the divine office, the cycle of prayers recited at fixed hours. From the midnight vigil, matins, to the evening prayers, compline, monks rose and gathered in the chapel, chanting psalms that echoed through stone halls. The hours of prayer punctuated their day like a heartbeat, reminding them of eternity even as they engaged in earthly tasks. Between prayers, monks worked. Some tilled fields, brewed ale, or tended livestock, while others copied manuscripts, illuminated texts, or taught novices. Meals were eaten in silence while a brother read aloud from Scripture. Silence itself was a discipline, meant to still the mind and focus it on God. Monasteries as centers of learning. Perhaps the greatest legacy of monasticism was the preservation of knowledge. In scriptoria, monks painstakingly copied ancient texts, classical works of philosophy, Roman law, medical treatises, ensuring their survival through centuries of turmoil. Without monasteries, much of the wisdom of antiquity might have been lost. Monastic schools also educated generations of clergy and occasionally lay students. They cultivated literacy in an age when few could read, and their libraries became treasuries of human thought. In this way, monasteries were bridges between the ancient and medieval worlds, guardians of both faith and culture. Art and architecture of the cloister. Monasteries were not merely practical institutions, they were also places of beauty. Cloisters, with their arcaded walkways surrounding tranquil gardens, symbolized the enclosed soul seeking God. Churches rose with Romanesque solidity or Gothic grace, filled with stained glass and carvings that lifted the heart toward the divine. Art flourished in monasteries. Illuminated manuscripts gleamed with gold and vivid colors, transforming scripture into visual splendor. Sacred music, plainchant and later polyphony, was cultivated within cloister walls, creating soundscapes that carried worshippers beyond the material world. Charity and hospitality. Monasteries were also centers of charity. They fed the hungry, cared for the sick, and offered shelter to travelers. Pilgrims journeying to holy sites often relied on monastic hospitality, finding rest and food along the way. In times of famine or plague, monasteries became lifelines for surrounding communities. This charitable role gave monasteries immense moral authority. They were seen as living out Christ's command to serve the least of his brethren, embodying ideals that the secular world often failed to meet. Wealth, power, and criticism. Yet monasteries were not immune to the temptations of wealth. Over time, many accumulated vast estates, collected rents, and wielded political influence. Some abbots became powerful lords, their abbeys rivaling castles in splendor. Critics accused them of hypocrisy, straying from their vows of poverty and simplicity. Reform movements repeatedly arose to restore discipline. The Cistercians, for example, sought a return to austerity, building simple stone churches and emphasizing manual labor. These cycles of decline and renewal reflected the ongoing struggle to reconcile spiritual ideals with worldly realities. The monastic legacy. By the later Middle Ages, monasteries faced new challenges. Universities began to eclipse them as centers of learning, and mendicant orders like the Franciscans embraced a more urban ministry. Yet the legacy of monasticism endured. Their manuscripts preserved knowledge, their architecture inspired awe, and their rhythms of prayer shaped the spirituality of Christendom. Even today, the ruins of abbeys across Europe speak of a time when communities dedicated themselves to silence, study, and service, creating a heritage that still resonates in culture and faith. Reflections for modern audiences. For modern viewers, the monastic world invites reflection on the balance between solitude and service, contemplation and action. In an age of constant noise and distraction, the monastic pursuit of silence feels strangely relevant. Their libraries remind us of the importance of preserving knowledge, while their hospitality recalls the timeless call to compassion. Monks may have withdrawn from the world, but in many ways they also saved it. Closing of Chapter 5. The cloisters of the medieval world were not retreats from history, but engines of culture, learning, and charity. Within their quiet walls, psalms were sung, books were saved, and communities were sustained. Monasteries remind us that power in the Middle Ages was not only found in castles and courts, but also in silence, prayer, and the patient labor of hands guided by faith. In an age when most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of their village, the idea of a journey across mountains, rivers, and foreign lands held both danger and wonder. For medieval Christians, the pilgrimage was no ordinary voyage. It was a sacred quest, a physical journey mirroring the inner path of the soul toward God. Pilgrimage and the veneration of relics shaped the imagination of Christendom, binding distant communities together through faith and movement. The meaning of pilgrimage. To undertake a pilgrimage was to step into a spiritual drama. Pilgrims set out to fulfill vows, seek healing, atone for sins, or draw nearer to holiness. The journey itself was seen as penitential. Walking mile after mile, enduring hunger, cold, and exhaustion, became a form of devotion. Each step carried symbolic weight, a movement from sin toward redemption. At its heart, pilgrimage reflected the Christian vision of life itself as a journey. Earthly existence was not an end but a passage, and the hardships of travel echoed the trials of the faithful seeking eternal rest. Major pilgrimage destinations. Medieval Europe was crisscrossed with routes leading to holy shrines. The three greatest destinations were Rome, Santiago de Compostela, and Jerusalem. Rome, with the tombs of Saints Peter and Paul, was the spiritual capital of the West. Pilgrims sought blessings from the Pope and relics of countless martyrs. Santiago de Compostela, in the far west of Spain, drew pilgrims to the shrine of St. James. The Camino de Santiago became one of the most iconic routes, marked by scallop shells and hospices offering shelter. Jerusalem, though distant and perilous, was the ultimate goal. To walk where Christ had walked was a dream that inspired not only pilgrims but also crusaders. Closer to home, countless local shrines attracted visitors. The bones of saints, drops of holy blood, or fragments of the true cross. Every region had its sacred places, weaving a web of devotion across Europe. Relics and their power. Relics lay at the heart of pilgrimage. A saint's body, a bone, a piece of clothing, or an object touched by them was believed to carry divine power. To venerate a relic was not idolatry, but a way of honoring God's work through his saints. Relics could heal the sick, protect communities, and legitimize rulers. They drew pilgrims by the thousands, bringing wealth to churches and towns. Entire cathedrals like Chartres were built to house them. Relics created a tangible connection between the faithful and the sacred, collapsing the distance between heaven and earth. The experience of the pilgrim. A pilgrim's journey was long and uncertain. Travelers wore simple clothing, carried a staff and a scrip, a small bag, and often bore a badge marking their destination. The scallop shell signaled Compostela. A palm branch showed one had reached Jerusalem. These symbols not only identified the pilgrim but also provided proof of devotion. Roads were dangerous. Bandits, disease, and hunger threatened pilgrims, yet they were also sustained by networks of hospitality. Monasteries, hospitals, and charitable houses offered shelter and food. Along the way, pilgrims formed communities, sharing stories and prayers as they walked together. For many, the moment of arrival at a shrine was overwhelming. To touch a relic, to see a saint's tomb, or to kneel in a holy place was to feel the nearness of the divine. Tears, confessions, and renewed vows often marked the end of the journey. Economic and cultural impact. Pilgrimage was not only a religious act, it was also an economic force. Towns along major routes prospered, selling food, lodging, and souvenirs. Artisans crafted pilgrim badges, and merchants traded goods from distant lands. The movement of pilgrims spread stories, songs, and cultural exchange, knitting Europe together in shared devotion. Architecture, too, reflected pilgrimage. Great churches were designed with wide aisles and radiating chapels to accommodate throngs of visitors. Roads, bridges, and hospitals were built to support the flow of travelers. In many ways, pilgrimage was medieval Europe's first mass movement of people. Criticism and reform. Not all viewed pilgrimage uncritically. Some clergy worried that it became more about spectacle and profit than genuine devotion. Relics were sometimes forged, and unscrupulous sellers preyed on gullible travelers. Satirists mocked those who treated pilgrimages as excuses for adventure or indulgence. Yet even critics acknowledged the deep spiritual power of true pilgrimage. Reformers sought to purify the practice, emphasizing inner conversion as the true goal. The tension between sincere devotion and worldly corruption echoed through the centuries. Reflections for modern audiences. Pilgrimage may seem distant from our world, but its themes remain familiar. Many today still undertake journeys, religious or secular, seeking meaning, healing, or transformation. To walk long distances, to leave behind comfort, to travel with intention. These remain timeless ways of reshaping the soul. Relics, too, remind us of the human need for tangible connection to memory and meaning. We still treasure objects linked to loved ones or historic events, sensing that they carry more than material value. Medieval devotion may have taken different forms, but the longing it expressed is universal. Closing of Chapter 6. The Pilgrim's Road was both hard and holy, filled with danger, exhaustion, hope, and joy. Pilgrimage connected villages to distant shrines, peasants to saints, and earth to heaven. Through relics and sacred journeys, medieval Christians found a way to make the invisible visible, to walk their faith step by step. If monasteries were havens of silence and prayer, cathedrals were the roaring heart of public faith. Rising above towns and cities, their towers and spires seemed to pierce the heavens, proclaiming the presence of the sacred to all who beheld them. To enter a medieval cathedral was to step into a world carefully designed to transport the soul from the dust of earth to the light of eternity. These were not merely buildings of stone, they were sermons in architecture, scripture in glass, and theaters of salvation. The vision behind the cathedral. The cathedral was more than a parish church. It was the seat of the bishop, the shepherd of an entire diocese, and thus a symbol of the church's authority and unity. Building a cathedral was an act of faith and ambition, often taking centuries to complete. Communities poured resources into their construction, convinced that such efforts honored God and ensured the intercession of heaven. Every stone laid, every arch raised, was understood as an offering. Cathedrals embodied the medieval belief that beauty itself could be a pathway to God. Their very scale reflected the grandeur of creation and the majesty of the divine. Romanesque solidity and Gothic light. The earliest cathedrals of the Romanesque period were massive, with thick walls, rounded arches, and small windows that let in little light. They conveyed strength and permanence, but also a sense of enclosure, as if the faithful were sheltered within the arms of a fortress of God. By the 12th century, Gothic architecture transformed the cathedral into something entirely new. Pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses allowed walls to soar upward, pierced with vast windows of stained glass. Light poured into the space, colored and transfigured, creating a vision of heaven on earth. Stained glass, stories in light. Nothing captured the imagination of worshippers like stained glass. In an age when few could read, these glowing windows told the stories of Scripture, saints, and salvation. Sunlight passing through red, blue, and gold glass filled the cathedral with radiant images, transforming the interior into a kaleidoscope of divine narrative. To stand in Chartres or Sainte-Chapelle, bathed in colored light, was to be immersed in theology made visible. The faithful did not need words. They could see the story of creation, the life of Christ, and the hope of resurrection in every panel. The cathedral as a community project. Building a cathedral was the work of generations. Stonemasons, carpenters, glassmakers, and laborers dedicated their lives to the project, often knowing they would never see it finished. Their guilds preserved skills, passed down secrets of geometry and engineering, and infused their craft with pride and devotion. Communities funded construction through tithes, donations, and indulgences. Even the poorest gave what they could, convinced that their contribution bound them to the sacred monument. In this sense, a cathedral was not the work of elites alone, but of entire towns united in a common act of faith. The cathedral as stage of life. Cathedrals were not silent monuments, they were living spaces. Within their walls, baptisms welcomed infants, marriages joined families, and funerals commended souls to God. Feast days filled the nave with processions, music, and incense. The liturgy unfolded like sacred drama, with priests, choirs, and congregations enacting the mysteries of salvation. At the same time, cathedrals served as civic centers. Markets gathered in their shadows, royal decrees were proclaimed on their steps, and councils met beneath their roofs. They were both sacred and public spaces, uniting heaven and earth, church and community. Music and the voice of the cathedral. If light gave the cathedral its color, music gave it its soul. Gregorian chant, polyphony, and organ music filled vast spaces designed for resonance. Choirs of monks or clerics lifted psalms that echoed against stone vaults, creating an atmosphere where sound itself seemed divine. The acoustics of cathedrals were no accident. Architects and musicians collaborated to create spaces where human voices could merge into something transcendent. For the faithful, music was prayer embodied in sound, a foretaste of the harmony of heaven. Symbolism in stone. Every element of a cathedral carried meaning. The cruciform floor plan reminded worshippers of Christ's sacrifice. The orientation toward the east symbolized resurrection and hope. Gargoyles, grotesque creatures perched on walls, warned of sin while also serving as clever waterspouts. Carvings on portals depicted the Last Judgment, reminding all who entered of eternity. The cathedral was not a neutral space, it was a symbolic cosmos where theology, art, and architecture converged to teach, inspire, and awe. Reflections for modern audiences. For us, cathedrals often appear as relics of the past, visited by tourists more than worshippers. Yet their power endures. They remind us of the human longing to reach beyond ourselves, to create beauty that points toward transcendence. Even today, to stand beneath their arches and hear music rise through colored light is to feel the persistence of wonder. In an age obsessed with speed and utility, the cathedral calls us to reflect on the value of patience, community, and the pursuit of something greater than ourselves. Closing of Chapter 7. The medieval cathedral was a symphony of stone and light, a testament to the faith and ambition of an age. Within its walls, generations prayed, worked, and dreamed, leaving behind monuments that continue to inspire awe. More than structures, cathedrals were visions of heaven raised upon earth, where every arch, every window, and every note of music pointed toward the eternal. Few episodes in medieval history stir as much passion and controversy as the Crusades. For some, they were noble quests, armed pilgrimages meant to liberate the Holy Land and protect Christendom. For others, they were bloody wars of conquest, fueled by zeal, politics, and greed. In truth, the Crusades were both acts of faith and ambition, sacrifice and brutality. They reshaped Europe and the Near East, leaving legacies of conflict but also of cultural encounter that echo through the centuries. The call to arms. The Crusades began with a voice. In 1095, Pope Urban II preached at Clermont in France, calling Christians to take up arms to free Jerusalem from Muslim control. He promised spiritual rewards, remission of sins, salvation for those who bore the cross. His words spread like wildfire, igniting a movement that drew nobles, peasants, knights, and clergy into a common cause. The appeal was both spiritual and practical. Knights, bound by ideals of chivalry and often restless in a Europe crowded with rivalries, saw in the crusade a chance for honor and redemption. Peasants and townsfolk, longing for purpose and escape, marched alongside them. The crusade became a vast pilgrimage, but one armed with swords and banners. The First Crusade and the capture of Jerusalem. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, was astonishing in its success. Against overwhelming odds, the Crusaders marched across Anatolia, survived famine and disease, and finally stormed Jerusalem in 1099. The city's capture was accompanied by massacre, Jews and Muslims slaughtered in streets that, according to chroniclers, ran with blood. For medieval Christians, this was a triumph of divine favor. For Muslims and Jews, it was a catastrophe. Jerusalem, sacred to all three Abrahamic faiths, had become the center of brutal contest. The Crusader states. After victory, the Crusaders established fragile kingdoms in the Holy Land, Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli. These states were outposts of Latin Christendom in a predominantly Muslim world, defended by castles and garrisons. They survived through uneasy alliances, trade, and constant warfare. Orders of warrior monks such as the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers arose to defend pilgrims and fortify the Crusader presence. Their blend of monastic discipline and martial skill embodied the paradox of the Crusades, holy men wielding swords. Later Crusades and shifting fortunes. Subsequent Crusades met with mixed results. The Second Crusade failed disastrously. The Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, brought legendary battles but no lasting conquest of Jerusalem. By the late 12th century, the great Muslim leader Saladin had retaken much of the Holy Land, including Jerusalem itself, becoming a figure admired even in Europe for his chivalry and magnanimity. The Fourth Crusade, however, marked a shocking betrayal. Instead of reaching the Holy Land, Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, looting the greatest Christian city of the East. This deepened the schism between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism, a wound that remains raw in historical memory. The human experience of crusading. For ordinary crusaders, life was harsh. They marched across deserts, endured hunger, and fought in unfamiliar lands under searing sun. Disease killed more than battle. Many never returned home. Yet their letters and chronicles reveal both profound devotion and moments of doubt. To take the cross was to gamble one's life and soul. Families were divided, lands mortgaged to fund the journey, and communities changed forever by those who left and those who never returned. Cultural exchange and encounter. Beyond war, the Crusades opened channels of contact. Crusaders encountered advanced Muslim medicine, science, and philosophy. They brought back knowledge of spices, textiles, and technologies. Arabic numerals, medical treatises, and even chess found their way into Europe through Crusader contact. Trade routes expanded, linking East and West more firmly. Italian cities like Venice and Genoa prospered, turning the Crusades into engines of commerce as much as campaigns of faith. Criticism and legacy. Even in their own time, the Crusades were not universally praised. Some saw them as misdirected violence, exploiting faith for wealth and power. As centuries passed, they became symbols of Christian unity and sacrifice to some, of aggression and intolerance to others. Their legacy is complex. They hardened divisions between Christianity and Islam, yet also fostered cultural transmission that enriched Europe. They remind us that faith can inspire both extraordinary devotion and devastating violence. Reflections for modern audiences. For us, the Crusades provoke uneasy questions. How far should one go in the name of belief? When does defense become conquest and devotion turn to destruction? These are not only medieval dilemmas but human ones, recurring in every age. At the same time, the Crusades highlight how cultures in conflict still exchange, borrow, and influence one another. Even amidst bloodshed, human curiosity and trade found ways to bridge divides. Closing of Chapter 8. The Crusades were not a single story but many, of pilgrims turned warriors, of kings and peasants, of bloodshed and dialogue. They reshaped the medieval world, leaving scars and legacies that remain with us. Above all, they reveal the paradox of humanity's search for the sacred, how the desire for heaven can lead both to noble sacrifice and to the flames of war. When we think of the Middle Ages, it is easy to picture castles, knights, and great battles. Yet the true backbone of medieval society was the village, the humble communities where peasants toiled, prayed, celebrated, and endured. For the vast majority of men and women, daily life was not lived in palaces or monasteries but in simple cottages, amidst fields and flocks, bound to the rhythm of the seasons. To step into a medieval village is to encounter the heart of an age, the quiet heroism of survival, the endurance of faith, and the shared joys of festivity. The village landscape. A medieval village was small, often no more than a cluster of wooden cottages with thatched roofs, arranged around a green or beside a stream. Smoke curled from hearths, livestock wandered freely, and the air carried the smell of tilled earth. At its center stood the parish church, humble, perhaps of stone if the community was fortunate, but always the focal point of spiritual and social life. Beyond lay the open fields, divided into strips worked by peasant families. Woodlands provided timber and game, while common pastures gave space for animals. Life was local, bound to soil and sky, yet within this narrow world stretched the drama of human existence. Work in the rhythm of the seasons. Labor defined village life. Men and women rose with the sun and worked until dusk, their tasks shifting with the calendar. Spring meant plowing and sowing, summer weeding and haymaking, autumn the harvest, winter mending tools and tending livestock. Peasant work was backbreaking yet communal. Families shared oxen, worked strips together and relied on neighbors. The village was not merely an economic unit but a cooperative web of survival. Tools were simple: wooden plows, sickles, scythes. Harvesting demanded speed and endurance, with entire villages in fields from dawn to dusk. Failure meant hunger. A bad harvest, brought by poor weather or blight, could spell famine, a constant shadow over medieval life. The structure of peasant society. Not all peasants were the same. Some were free tenants, renting land from a lord. Others were serfs, bound to the manor, owing labor as well as rent. Yet distinctions blurred in daily toil. All bent over the same soil, all felt the same weariness at day's end. The lord's manor house loomed as both authority and protection. Peasants owed dues in grain, eggs, or livestock, and performed boon work on the lord's domain. In return, the manor offered justice, defense, and a share in the ordered world of feudal obligation. Faith as daily bread. Religion infused every moment of village life. The tolling of the church bell marked hours of prayer. The calendar was measured not only in agricultural seasons but in holy days: Easter, Christmas, saints' feasts. Even work was sanctified, offered to God as labor of obedience. The village priest baptized infants, blessed marriages, and buried the dead. His sermons instructed peasants in faith, morality, and obedience. The church was not merely spiritual but social. Its festivals, processions, and masses brought color and meaning to otherwise harsh lives. Superstition mingled with official faith. Charms, blessings, and folk rituals coexisted with sacraments, reflecting the peasant desire for protection in a world full of unseen dangers. Food and daily sustenance. Peasant diet was humble, built on bread, pottage, a thick soup of grains and vegetables, and ale. Meat was rare, reserved for feast days, though fish, eggs, and dairy offered variety. Hunger was frequent, especially in the lean months before harvest. Yet meals were shared, and even poor households gathered around the hearth to eat together. Food was never only sustenance, it was fellowship, the glue of family and community. Festivity and leisure. Though life was harsh, it was not without joy. Festivals punctuated the year, often tied to the church calendar. Harvest time brought celebration with dancing, music, and communal feasts. Saints' days were excuses for games, plays, and merriment. Marriage feasts filled villages with song. Storytellers, minstrels, and traveling performers brought moments of wonder. Even simple village games, wrestling, ball play, singing, brought relief from endless labor. These moments of festivity were vital. They reminded peasants that life was not only toil but also laughter, not only burden but blessing. The shadow of hardship. Yet the village was never free from hardship. Famine struck with terrifying regularity. Disease, especially the plague in later centuries, could devastate entire communities. Bandits, war, and the demands of lords weighed heavily on peasants. Life expectancy was short, children often died young, and the struggle for survival was constant. And yet, resilience was born of necessity. Villagers endured through solidarity, faith, and tradition, finding meaning in family bonds and the turning of the seasons. Reflections for modern audiences. For us, accustomed to abundance and technology, the life of medieval peasants may seem grim. Yet there is something profound in their endurance. They remind us of humanity's dependence on nature, of the dignity of work, and of the strength found in community. Their lives, though materially poor, were rich in ritual, tradition, and shared identity. In their simple cottages and village greens, they built the foundations of Europe's cultural memory. Closing of Chapter 9. The medieval village was the heartbeat of the Middle Ages, a world of toil and festivity, faith and hardship, resilience and joy. In their daily lives, peasants wove the fabric of medieval society, shaping an age not through battles or crowns, but through the quiet persistence of ordinary lives. If the village embodied daily life and the castle represented power, the knight embodied ideals, martial skill, loyalty, and honor. Knights were the warriors of the Middle Ages, but their role was not only to fight. They were symbols, living representations of a society obsessed with hierarchy, valor, and the performance of identity. From the battlefield to the tournament grounds, the knightly world was a mixture of danger, ceremony, and spectacle. The making of a knight. Knighthood was earned, not inherited. Boys destined for this path began as pages in noble households, learning courtesy, weaponry, and religious instruction. By adolescence, they became squires, assisting knights in armor and on campaign. This apprenticeship taught not only combat, but discipline, obedience, and the ideals of chivalry. At the age of majority, a squire could be dubbed a knight in a solemn ceremony. This act was both spiritual and social. The young warrior swore oaths of loyalty, promised to defend the weak, and was consecrated with sword and accolade. From that moment he entered a brotherhood bound by honor, duty, and recognition. The knight's equipment and lifestyle. A knight's equipment was both practical and symbolic. Mail shirts and later plate armor protected him in battle, while surcoats bore heraldic colors proclaiming lineage and allegiance. Horses, carefully bred and trained, were as vital as swords, enabling mobility and dominance on the battlefield. Yet life as a knight was costly. Maintenance of armor, weapons, and mounts required wealth. Many knights depended on the patronage of lords or lands granted in return for service. Their existence was therefore inseparable from the feudal hierarchy, a constant negotiation between martial independence and loyalty to a superior. The code of chivalry. Chivalry was not merely decoration, it was a moral and social code. Knights were expected to protect the weak, serve their lord faithfully, and act with honor in war. Courtesy toward ladies, honesty in combat, and piety were emphasized, though adherence varied in practice. The chivalric ideal was often romanticized, yet it shaped the very way warfare and social interaction were conducted. A knight who violated these principles risked disgrace, loss of status, and exclusion from the brotherhood. Chivalry was thus both aspiration and discipline. Tournaments, sport and spectacle. Outside the battlefield, knights displayed skill in tournaments, events that combined sport, pageantry, and social theater. Justs, melees, and mock battles tested strength, speed, and courage. Audiences gathered to watch, cheer, and place wagers, while nobles used these occasions to demonstrate wealth and influence. Tournaments were rehearsals for war, but also elaborate performances. Knights wore heraldic symbols, banners fluttered, trumpets blared, and ladies presented favors. These spectacles reinforced social hierarchy, celebrated martial culture, and provided a controlled outlet for violence. The romantic dimension. Knights were inseparable from the world of courtly love. Poetry, songs, and tales glorified their devotion to ladies, often idealized or unattainable. This romantic dimension was intertwined with martial life. The knight was not only a warrior but a symbol of loyalty, courage, and virtue. While often symbolic, these ideals influenced behavior. Knights were expected to act as guardians of women, protectors of the weak, and models of honor. Even in a world dominated by violence, culture and morality played central roles in defining what it meant to be a knight. Knights in warfare. Despite the pageantry, knights were first and foremost soldiers. On the battlefield they could be decisive. Heavy cavalry charges, disciplined formations, and the leadership of knightly commanders often turned the tide of battle. Yet warfare was brutal, chaotic, and deadly. Armor could fail, horses could fall, and swords could strike home. The life of a knight was a constant tension between glory and mortality. Knights also fought in the Crusades, defended castles, and enforced the authority of their lords. Their service was a mixture of fealty, ambition, and religious duty, a human embodiment of the medieval social order. Reflections for modern audiences. Knighthood fascinates us not only for its martial prowess, but for its moral and cultural significance. It illustrates the interplay between power and ethics, violence and virtue. Modern ideas of honor, loyalty, and duty owe much to the knightly ideal, even if the swords and horses have disappeared. The knight reminds us that heroism is as much about ethical courage as physical strength, and that societal roles, however ceremonial, shape both behavior and identity. Closing of Chapter 10. Knights were warriors, performers, and moral exemplars. Through tournaments, battles, and the codes of chivalry, they embodied the ideals of an age that valued courage, loyalty, and honor above all. The theater of chivalry was as much about spectacle and symbolism as it was about sword and shield, offering medieval society models of virtue and valor that continue to capture the imagination today. War in the Middle Ages was both art and terror, a complex blend of strategy, brute force, and human endurance. Castles, knights, and infantry were the instruments of conflict, yet the true theater of medieval warfare extended beyond the battlefield. It involved logistics, alliances, diplomacy, and sometimes sheer luck. To understand medieval history is to understand its wars, not as abstract events, but as lived experiences that shaped communities, families, and societies. The nature of medieval armies. Medieval armies were far from professional by modern standards. They were often composed of levied peasants, knights called to service, mercenaries, and retinues of nobles. Numbers fluctuated based on feudal obligations, seasonal campaigns, and the wealth of lords. Discipline varied. Some units moved in coordinated formations while others dissolved into chaos. Knights formed the backbone of many forces, their heavily armored cavalry providing shock and prestige. Infantry, armed with spears, bows, or crossbows, often determined battles more than knights alone. Archers at Crécy and Agincourt would later demonstrate the lethal effectiveness of skill over brute force. Siege warfare, the art of patience. Many wars were not decided in open battle but at the walls of fortresses. Siege warfare required ingenuity, engineering, and extraordinary patience. Attackers employed ladders, siege towers, battering rams, and catapults to breach defenses. Defenders relied on thick walls, moats, boiling oil, and archers to repel them. Sieges could last months or even years. Starvation was a weapon as effective as any trebuchet. Civilians often suffered most, huddled behind walls while disease and hunger spread. The psychological strain was immense, with morale and leadership playing as critical a role as physical fortifications. Tactics and strategy. Commanders relied on a combination of mobility, terrain, and intelligence. Ambushes, feigned retreats, and strategic positioning often won battles against numerically superior foes. Fortifications dictated the flow of war. Castles controlled roads, river crossings, and supply lines. In this sense, strategy was not only martial but geographical and economic. Lords and kings were themselves generals, expected to lead by example. Their presence could inspire troops or, conversely, turn the tide toward disaster if misjudged. Warfare demanded courage, calculation, and adaptability. Weapons, armor, and technology. Medieval technology evolved continually. Swords, lances, axes, and maces were standard, while longbows and crossbows extended the reach of infantry. Plate armor gradually replaced chainmail, and siege engines became more sophisticated. Each innovation altered tactics and transformed the battlefield. Yet technology alone did not guarantee victory. Morale, discipline, and leadership often determined the outcome, while alliances and betrayals reshaped the strategic landscape. War was as much a game of human factors as of steel and stone. The human cost. Warfare exacted a heavy toll on soldiers and civilians alike. Death, injury, and disease were constant companions. Ransoms for captured nobles were a common practice, blending commerce with conflict. Villages were burned, fields laid waste, and families displaced. The Middle Ages were an age in which survival often depended on both skill and fortune. For knights and soldiers, valor was intertwined with mortality. Tales of heroic deeds, often romanticized in later literature, reflect the tension between duty, ambition, and the omnipresence of death. The battlefield was a crucible of courage, fear, and endurance. Psychological and cultural dimensions. Medieval warfare was also performative. The sight of banners, the blowing of horns, and the clash of armor communicated status, resolve, and intimidation. Victories reinforced legitimacy, while defeats could undermine authority. Public executions, displays of captured enemies, and ceremonial entries into towns all blurred the line between war and theater. Religion too played a role. Many conflicts were framed as holy or just, providing moral justification for acts of violence. Crusades, for instance, merged military and spiritual objectives, illustrating how ideology could mobilize entire societies. Reflections for modern audiences. Today we may view medieval warfare as brutal and archaic, yet its lessons endure. Strategy, logistics, and leadership remain critical in both military and civilian endeavors. More profoundly, the human dimensions, courage, loyalty, fear, and resilience, remain timeless. Understanding medieval war is not to glorify bloodshed, but to grasp the pressures, decisions, and sacrifices that shaped a world where survival and honor were inseparable. Closing of Chapter 11. Medieval warfare was a complex interplay of technology, tactics, and human spirit. From sieges that tested patience to battles that demanded courage, it shaped the destiny of nations and the daily lives of countless people. Knights, peasants, and civilians alike were bound in the drama of conflict, leaving a legacy of strategy, heroism, and reflection that continues to fascinate us today. While the countryside sustained life, the medieval town represented commerce, craft, and the pulsating energy of innovation. Towns were centers where peasants, merchants, artisans and nobles intersected, creating dynamic social and economic networks. From bustling marketplaces to artisan workshops, the medieval town was the engine of cultural and technological progress, even as it remained deeply intertwined with feudal authority. The rise of towns. The growth of towns in the 11th and 12th centuries transformed Europe. Improved agriculture allowed surplus food to feed non-farming populations, while trade networks expanded across rivers, coasts, and overland routes. Towns attracted merchants, artisans, and scholars, fostering opportunities for wealth and social mobility previously unimaginable in the rigid rural world. Towns were often granted charters by kings or lords, offering privileges like the right to hold markets, self-governance, or protection from certain taxes. These charters encouraged economic activity and gave townspeople a measure of autonomy, balancing the authority of lords with the collective strength of the citizenry. Markets and commerce. The marketplace was the town's heartbeat. Merchants sold grain, cloth, spices, and imported luxury goods. Shouts, the clatter of carts, and the smell of fresh bread and tanned leather filled the air. Fairs, held on feast days, attracted buyers and sellers from far and wide, transforming towns into centers of regional and international trade. Trade required infrastructure. Bridges, roads, and ports facilitated the movement of goods. Standardized weights, measures, and coinage allowed transactions to proceed efficiently. In this bustling environment, innovation thrived, from better plows and watermills to the first rudimentary banking systems. Guilds, craft and control. Artisans organized themselves into guilds, powerful associations that regulated trade, quality, and training. Blacksmiths, weavers, masons, and shoemakers belonged to craft guilds that maintained standards and protected members' interests. Guilds provided apprenticeships, ensuring skills passed from generation to generation, and offered social support in times of illness or death. Guild halls became centers of civic life. Members not only worked together but also celebrated festivals, contributed to religious events, and sometimes participated in town governance. Guilds exemplified the medieval fusion of work, community, and morality. Town life, society and hierarchy. Life in the town contrasted with the countryside. Houses were closer together, often built of timber with overhanging upper floors. Streets were narrow and winding, crowded with animals, traders, and townsfolk. The walls of the town offered protection, but also reinforced hierarchy. Wealthy merchants and guild masters occupied larger homes, while laborers and apprentices lived in cramped quarters. Despite social stratification, towns fostered interaction and opportunity. Literacy and numeracy spread more rapidly, and people could pursue careers beyond agriculture. The urban environment cultivated civic pride and identity, offering a degree of mobility rare in medieval society. Religion and culture in towns. Churches and chapels remained central, providing not only spiritual guidance but also education and charity. Saints' feast days and processions brought the community together. Towns were also cultural hubs. Minstrels, traveling performers, and scholars introduced ideas, stories, and innovations. Markets and fairs often doubled as stages for drama, music, and public announcements. Art and architecture flourished. Stonework, carved facades, and town halls reflected both wealth and civic pride. In this way, the town was both functional and symbolic, a space where human creativity, enterprise, and faith intersected. Challenges and hazards. Life in towns was vibrant but not without danger. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and fires were constant threats. Plagues, such as the Black Death, decimated urban populations, revealing the fragility of human settlements. Crime and political unrest also tested townspeople, requiring organization and law enforcement to maintain order. Yet towns endured, adapting through charters, guilds, and communal cooperation. Their resilience reflected both the ingenuity and determination of medieval urban society. Reflections for modern audiences. Medieval towns remind us of the enduring human drive to trade, innovate, and form communities. Even in challenging conditions, people created networks, systems, and cultural spaces that allowed society to thrive. They illustrate that economic life, like faith or warfare, shapes the contours of history and leaves legacies visible even today. Towns were laboratories of social and technological progress, demonstrating that innovation often arises from human collaboration and the need to solve practical problems. Closing of Chapter 12. The medieval town was a nexus of commerce, craft, and culture, a place where work, faith, and innovation intertwined. Markets buzzed with energy, guilds regulated skill and morality, and streets echoed with life. Towns bridged rural and elite worlds, shaping the Middle Ages as both functional spaces and centers of human creativity, leaving a legacy that continues to inform modern urban life. In a world without modern hospitals or antibiotics, the line between life and death was fragile. Medieval medicine was a mixture of observation, tradition, faith, and folklore, practiced by a spectrum of healers, from learned physicians to village-wise women. Illness was not understood as purely biological but as an imbalance of humors, divine punishment, or influence of unseen forces. To enter the world of medieval healing is to confront both the ingenuity and the limits of an age shaped by faith and observation. Medical theory and practice. Medieval medicine inherited much from ancient Greece and Rome. The theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, dominated medical thought. Health was a balance of these humors, illness a sign of imbalance. Treatments included bloodletting, purgatives, and dietary regulation, often tailored to the patient's temperament, age, and season. Universities trained physicians in theory, but their practical experience was often limited. Their knowledge was scholarly, derived from texts like Galen or Avicenna, and accessible mostly to the wealthy who could afford consultation. Ordinary villagers relied on simpler remedies, herbs, poultices, and charms, blending observation with centuries of local knowledge. Herbal remedies and folk medicine. Plants were the primary tools of healing. Willow bark eased pain, lavender soothed ailments, and garlic was valued for its antimicrobial properties. Monastic gardens preserved medicinal plants, combining herbal wisdom with prayerful care. Apothecaries sold remedies and spices, bridging the gap between home care and professional medicine. Folk healers, often women, combined herbs with rituals, incantations, and charms. They were the first line of care in villages, treating fevers, wounds, and digestive issues. While sometimes accused of superstition, their practical knowledge saved countless lives. Faith and healing. Religion permeated all aspects of medieval medicine. Pilgrimages to holy sites, prayers, relics, and the intercession of saints were common treatments. Illness was often perceived as divine punishment, and cures as blessings. Hospitals attached to monasteries provided care for the sick, poor, and travelers, reflecting both piety and practical concern. Miraculous healings, documented in hagiographies, reinforced the link between spirituality and medicine. The boundary between physical and spiritual intervention was fluid. Prayer, charms, and rituals were considered as essential as herbs or surgery. Surgery and wounds. Surgery was risky and limited. Barbers often doubled as surgeons, performing bloodletting, amputations, and tooth extraction. Battlefield wounds and accidents required improvisation. Cauterization, poultices, and herbal ointments were standard treatments. Infection, ignorance of antisepsis, and the lack of anesthesia made outcomes uncertain. Nevertheless, surgeons developed skill in trauma care and specialized techniques, particularly for fractures, eye ailments, and abscesses. These practitioners combined observation, experience, and practical ingenuity, even within the constraints of contemporary understanding. Plagues and epidemics. Epidemics were among the most feared threats. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the mid-14th century, revealed both the limits and the resilience of medieval medicine. Physicians and healers tried everything from bloodletting to quarantine, often with little success. Communities turned to prayer, pilgrimage, and ritual in desperate hope. The social impact was profound. Populations shrank, economies collapsed, and entire villages vanished. Survivors developed new approaches to sanitation, urban planning, and public health, demonstrating that crises can spur innovation even in an age dominated by superstition. Reflections for modern audiences. Medieval medicine reminds us that health is both a scientific and social phenomenon. The blending of observation, ritual, and community care reveals the human desire to confront uncertainty and suffering. While modern medicine has vastly expanded our capabilities, the medieval approach emphasizes a holistic understanding of body, mind, and spirit. It also highlights the courage of those who cared for the sick, often at great personal risk, and the resilience of communities facing relentless threats. Their creativity and adaptability remain inspiring, even centuries later. Closing of Chapter 13. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a world of contrasts. Learned physicians and folk healers, herbal remedies and prayer, theory and improvisation. It was both limited and remarkable, pragmatic and spiritual. By studying medieval healing, we gain insight not only into the fragility of life but into the enduring human quest to understand, treat, and alleviate suffering. In an age often associated with castles and swords, the pursuit of knowledge thrived in cloisters, cathedral schools, and emerging universities. Education in the Middle Ages was both a privilege and a vocation, shaping the intellectual life of Europe and laying the foundations for the Renaissance. To explore medieval learning is to encounter a world where curiosity, faith, and discipline intertwined, and where the written word became a bridge between the human and the divine. The foundations of learning. Education began with the church. Monastic and cathedral schools were the primary centers of learning, focusing on literacy, Latin, and religious instruction. Boys, primarily sons of nobles or the clergy, learned to read sacred texts, write, and perform basic arithmetic. Religious devotion was inseparable from study. Learning was both a means to serve God and to navigate the social hierarchy. Monks meticulously copied manuscripts, preserving classical works and biblical texts. Libraries within abbeys became repositories of knowledge, often accessible only to the learned. The laborious work of transcription ensured that texts survived centuries, enabling the flow of ideas across generations. The rise of universities. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe witnessed the emergence of universities in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. These institutions offered structured curricula in the liberal arts, law, medicine, and theology. Students, some as young as 14, engaged in lectures, disputations, and rigorous debate. Universities formalized learning, standardized degrees, and fostered scholarly communities. Professors held authority, while students developed networks that transcended local boundaries. Latin served as the lingua franca, linking scholars from France to Italy, Spain to England. In this way, medieval universities became hubs of intellectual exchange, curricula and scholarly pursuits. The trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, formed the foundation of education, while the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, provided mathematical and scientific grounding. Theology was considered the queen of sciences, integrating reason with faith. Scholars engaged with texts from Aristotle, Galen, Avicenna, and Boethius, reconciling classical philosophy with Christian doctrine. Debate was central. Disputations allowed students and masters to defend arguments, refine reasoning, and explore new ideas. The medieval classroom was not passive, it was a theater of intellect, where dialogue sharpened both mind and spirit. Libraries and manuscripts. Books were precious commodities copied painstakingly by hand. Monks, scribes, and later secular scholars illuminated texts with gold, intricate designs, and vivid illustrations. Libraries stored scrolls and codices, providing access to religious, philosophical, and scientific knowledge. The preservation of knowledge was itself an act of devotion. Each manuscript reflected not only the content but the care and discipline of its creator. Libraries became cultural hubs, attracting scholars from near and far, and forming the backbone of intellectual life in medieval Europe. Education beyond the elite. While universities and cathedral schools catered to the privileged, literacy and basic education gradually spread to towns. Guilds often trained apprentices in trade, combining practical skills with numeracy and record-keeping. In some cases, women, particularly in convents, received instruction in reading, writing, and domestic management. Education therefore was layered, elite and specialized, yet with ripples reaching broader society. Knowledge was valued not only for personal advancement but also for the cohesion and progress of communities. The interplay of faith and reason. Medieval scholars did not see a conflict between learning and faith. The pursuit of knowledge was understood as a means to understand God's creation. Science, philosophy, and theology were interconnected. Reasoning was a tool to illuminate divine truth. Figures such as Thomas Aquinas exemplified this synthesis, blending Aristotelian logic with Christian theology to create enduring intellectual frameworks. The medieval mind sought harmony, integrating observation, reflection, and spiritual insight. Education was thus both practical and transcendent, a pathway to worldly competence and spiritual wisdom. Reflections for modern audiences. Medieval education reminds us that learning is more than vocational training. It is a discipline of the mind and soul. The care devoted to manuscripts, libraries, and structured debate reflects a culture that treasured inquiry, precision, and intellectual community. Even today, universities echo medieval principles. Mentorship, discourse, and the pursuit of truth remain central to scholarship. By studying medieval learning, we see the roots of modern education and the enduring human commitment to knowledge. Closing of Chapter 14. Education in the Middle Ages was a beacon amid castles and battlefields. From monastic schools to bustling universities, it nurtured curiosity, discipline, and moral reflection. Scholars, scribes, and students preserved, debated, and expanded knowledge, leaving a legacy that shaped not only their own era but the intellectual landscape of the centuries that followed. In the medieval world, religion was the axis around which life revolved. From the humblest peasant to the highest noble, faith shaped thought, behavior, and society itself. Churches and cathedrals dominated skylines, monasteries offered sanctuary and scholarship, and rituals permeated every aspect of daily existence. To understand medieval culture is to understand its religion, not as abstract doctrine, but as lived experience filled with devotion, fear, and hope. The centrality of ritual. Ritual governed the rhythm of medieval life. The daily cycle of prayer marked time. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline created a sacred heartbeat in monastic and lay life alike. Sacraments, baptism, confirmation, marriage, and the Eucharist, structured existence, transforming personal milestones into communal and spiritual events. Festivals and feast days punctuated the year, bringing color, music, and celebration. Christmas, Easter, saints' days, and local religious fairs provided opportunities for worship, leisure, and social cohesion. In medieval society, the sacred and the everyday were inseparable, each reinforcing the other. The cult of saints. Saints were the heroes of faith, mediators between humanity and the divine. Relics, bones, clothing, or objects associated with holy figures were venerated as conduits of power and protection. Pilgrimages to sites such as Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or Rome were acts of devotion, penance, and spiritual aspiration. Saints inspired moral behavior and offered models of virtue. Hagiography celebrated their deeds, miracles, and martyrdoms, providing narratives that educated, motivated, and comforted the faithful. Pilgrimages, often arduous and dangerous, were journeys of both body and soul, symbolizing the human pursuit of holiness. Monastic life. Monasteries were centers of learning, prayer, and labor. Monks and nuns lived according to strict rules, such as the rule of Saint Benedict, balancing prayer, work, and study. They copied manuscripts, tended gardens, educated children, and cared for the sick. Monastic devotion inspired communities and served as a model of spiritual discipline. Monks were the guardians of tradition, the preservers of knowledge, and often the mediators of local disputes. Their presence symbolized stability in a turbulent world. Popular religion. Beyond monasteries, lay people practiced religion in ways that mixed orthodoxy with local custom. Pilgrimages, prayers, votive offerings, and folk rituals addressed illness, misfortune, or desire for blessings. Religious festivals allowed communal expression of faith, joy, and identity. Cathedrals and parish churches served as centers for worship, education, and social gathering. Even in rural hamlets, the church anchored life, offering guidance, structure, and spiritual reassurance. The power of the church. The church was both spiritual and political. Bishops and abbots wielded authority, influencing kings, lords, and townspeople. Canon law governed marriage, inheritance, and moral conduct. Religious councils shaped doctrine and mediated disputes. Pilgrimages, relics, indulgences, and sermons were tools of devotion but also instruments of social cohesion and control. The church shaped culture, morality, and governance, intertwining divine authority with earthly power. Religious conflict and reform. Religious devotion was not without tension. Heresy, schisms, and calls for reform challenged the church, reflecting both spiritual and social pressures. Movements like the Franciscans emphasized poverty and simplicity, offering alternatives to institutional wealth and hierarchy. These tensions reveal the dynamic and evolving nature of medieval faith. Religious practice was diverse, vibrant, and sometimes contentious, yet it remained the central pillar of medieval identity. Reflections for modern audiences. Medieval religion teaches us about the integration of faith and daily life. It reveals the human desire for meaning, community, and transcendence. While contemporary society separates sacred and secular, the Middle Ages illustrate a world where life itself was a ritual, and belief informed every decision from the fields to the halls of kings. Pilgrimages, saints, and devotion remind us that spiritual aspiration is timeless, and that rituals, whether grand or simple, provide structure, reflection, and connection. Closing of Chapter 15. Religion in the Middle Ages was the fabric of existence. Through rituals, saints, pilgrimages, and monastic devotion, people navigated a world of uncertainty, seeking guidance, protection, and purpose. The church shaped morality, society, and culture, leaving an indelible mark on history, demonstrating that faith in its many forms is both a personal and communal journey. The medieval landscape is inseparable from its castles, stone sentinels rising from hills and riverbanks, symbols of power, protection, and prestige. These fortresses were not merely military installations, they were homes, courts, centers of administration, and manifestations of authority. To walk among medieval castles is to witness architecture as both art and instrument, blending practical defense with social, political, and symbolic meaning. The evolution of castles. Early medieval fortifications were simple. Wooden motte and bailey structures provided basic defense and visibility. Over centuries, these evolved into stone keeps, concentric castles, and fortified palaces. Walls thickened, towers rose, and moats and drawbridges enhanced security. Each innovation responded to military technology from siege engines to crossbows, reflecting the constant dialogue between attack and defense. Castles were living structures, constantly adapted to both threats and domestic needs. Their architecture balanced function with display. Imposing gates and towers signaled strength, while ornate halls and chapels reflected wealth and status. Daily life within castles. A castle was a self-contained world. The lord and his family lived in the great hall, attended by servants, retainers, and guards. Kitchens produced meals for dozens. Chambers housed guests and residents. Courtyards buzzed with activity, training, repairs, and preparations for courtly ceremonies. Life within stone walls was hierarchical yet interdependent. Knights trained, artisans worked, and servants carried out essential tasks. Even in war, domestic rhythms persisted. Meals, prayers, and festivals maintained order and morale. Castles were both bastions of defense and centers of human activity. Fortification and defense. Defense dictated design. High curtain walls, arrow slits, and murder holes provided strategic advantage. Towers offered vantage points for surveillance, while moats and drawbridges slowed attackers. Concentric castles, with multiple defensive rings, exemplified the medieval mastery of layered protection. Inside, provisions were stored for sieges, grain, water, and armaments. Castles were prepared for prolonged conflict, reflecting the constant threat of war and the need for self-sufficiency. Military architecture was not only technical but psychological. An imposing fortress projected authority and deterred rebellion. Symbolism and prestige. Beyond practical function, castles conveyed status. Their height, materials, and decoration communicated the lord's power and taste. Palatial halls displayed tapestries, heraldry, and art, blending martial authority with cultural sophistication. The architecture itself became a language of dominance, visible to subjects, rivals, and visitors alike. Chapels and chapels within castles emphasized piety, reinforcing the moral authority of the lord. The integration of defense, domesticity, and religious observance embodied the medieval ideal, that leadership required courage, governance, and virtue. Urban and rural interplay. Castles often anchored towns, providing protection while drawing commerce and artisans to nearby settlements. Markets, workshops, and inns flourished in the shadow of stone walls. Castles and towns were mutually dependent. The fortress offered security, while the urban environment sustained daily life and economic vitality. Their presence shaped landscape, society, and politics. Roads, rivers, and hills were chosen strategically, intertwining natural geography with human ingenuity. Castles became focal points of medieval life, shaping both local and regional identity. Legacy and reflection. Medieval castles endure as symbols of human ambition, creativity, and adaptability. They remind us that architecture is not merely functional. It is expressive, communicating values, hierarchy, and aspiration. The interplay of defense, domestic life, and prestige illustrates how humans shape spaces to meet practical and symbolic needs simultaneously. Even in ruin, castles captivate. Their walls echo with history, their halls hint at past ceremonies, battles, and daily routines. They are monuments to both survival and imagination, blending strength with artistry, necessity with display. Closing of Chapter 16. Castles were more than stone and mortar, they were centers of power, community, and culture. Fortresses, palaces, and keeps combined defense, domesticity, and symbolism, reflecting the complexities of medieval life. To study castles is to study an age of ingenuity, ambition, and artistry, where every tower, wall, and hall tells a story of authority, resilience, and human vision. Art in the Middle Ages was more than decoration. It was a language, a medium through which people expressed faith, power, and cultural identity. From illuminated manuscripts to grand tapestries, from cathedral sculptures to stained glass, medieval art communicated meaning, instructed the faithful and immortalized ideals. To enter the world of medieval art is to uncover a society that wove symbol, narrative, and devotion into every creation. Illuminated manuscripts, books as art. Monks and scribes transformed texts into masterpieces. Illuminated manuscripts combined calligraphy, vivid pigments, and gold leaf, turning words into visual poetry. Religious texts were the most common, with the Bible, psalters, and prayer books rendered in intricate detail. Illustrations were not mere ornamentation. They conveyed stories, moral lessons, and theological concepts to a largely illiterate population. Every margin, initial, and miniature held meaning. Saints' lives, biblical episodes, and allegorical creatures guided contemplation, instruction, and devotion. The creation of a manuscript was painstaking, often taking months or years. It was a labor of devotion as much as a craft, reflecting the medieval intertwining of faith, learning, and aesthetics. Tapestries and textile art. Tapestries adorned walls of castles, palaces, and churches, serving both decorative and practical purposes. Woven from wool, silk, and sometimes precious metals, tapestries depicted biblical stories, historical events, or legendary tales. Beyond their beauty, tapestries communicated messages of power and prestige. Noble families commissioned tapestries to display wealth, commemorate victories, or assert lineage. The detailed imagery allowed viewers to read narratives visually, making history and myth accessible in a medium that combined storytelling with artistry. Sculpture and architecture. Stone and wood carvings brought symbolic meaning to architecture. Cathedrals and churches featured elaborate facades, gargoyles, and reliefs, narrating scripture and moral lessons to the community. Sculptures served as catechisms in stone, teaching morality through imagery visible to all regardless of literacy. Even functional elements, doors, capitals, and column decorations, carried symbolic significance. Animals, plants, and mythical creatures represented virtues, vices, or divine forces. Art and architecture were inseparable, merging structural necessity with visual storytelling. Stained glass and light. Stained glass transformed sunlight into spiritual experience. Cathedrals became immersive theaters of color and narrative. Windows illustrated biblical scenes, lives of saints, and allegorical motifs, guiding worshippers' contemplation through light and color. The interplay of sunlight, glass, and architecture created a transformative space, turning ordinary interiors into luminous embodiments of faith. Art became experiential, enveloping the senses and inspiring reflection. Symbolism and allegory. Symbolism was central to medieval art. Colors, gestures, animals, and architectural elements conveyed layered meanings. Red might signify martyrdom, blue devotion, or gold divine light. Lions represented courage, serpents evil, and unicorns purity. Understanding these symbols allowed viewers to read stories and ideas encoded visually, bridging narrative, spirituality, and morality. Allegory provided moral and spiritual lessons. From illuminated manuscripts to tapestries and frescoes, art instructed viewers on virtue, sin, and the divine order. Medieval audiences experienced art as education, inspiration, and moral guidance. Art in daily and courtly life. Art was not confined to sacred spaces. Nobles commissioned paintings, tapestries, and decorated objects for personal devotion or display. Jewelry, illuminated letters, and carved furniture reflected status, taste, and identity. Even common households used decorated items, talismans, and visual symbols to express belief and protect the home. Art was, in essence, a language accessible to many layers of society, bridging literacy, social class, and culture. Reflections for modern audiences. Medieval art teaches us that creativity is deeply connected to meaning and belief. Every brushstroke, weave, and carving was intentional, designed to instruct, inspire, or assert identity. Modern audiences can learn to read art not only aesthetically but culturally, appreciating the interplay of symbolism, devotion, and social function. Medieval art reminds us that beauty can serve purpose. It can educate, inspire, and communicate across time, leaving messages that survive centuries. Closing of Chapter 17. Medieval art was a symphony of image, color, and symbol. Illuminated manuscripts, tapestries, sculptures, and stained glass carried stories, lessons, and ideals. Through its forms, medieval society communicated faith, power, and identity, creating a visual language that continues to speak to us. Art in the Middle Ages was more than beauty, It was a mirror of thought, belief, and imagination.